Welcome to Unsolved Cases, where we take another deep dive into one of America's most perplexing and heartbreaking unsolved mysteries. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and today we're examining the case that has captivated and horrified the nation for nearly 3 decades: the murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. On December 26, 1996, what should have been a joyful morning after Christmas in Boulder, Colorado, instead became the beginning of a nightmare that would expose police incompetence, media sensationalism, and a labyrinth of evidence that continues to baffle investigators today. This isn't just the story of a little girl's tragic death. It's a case study in how everything that could go wrong in a murder investigation did go wrong. Today, we'll walk through the shocking discovery of JonBenét's body, examine the catastrophic mishandling of the crime scene, delve into the mysterious ransom note that may hold the key to everything, and explore the various suspects and theories that have emerged over the years. We'll also look at how the media turned a family's tragedy into entertainment, and how scientific advances in DNA testing would eventually reshape our understanding of this case. So settle in, because this is a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the JonBenét Ramsey murder. If you're hooked on true crime and unsolved mysteries like the JonBenét Ramsey case, Scoob is your go-to podcast studio. Scoob delivers short, binge-worthy podcasts for your daily fix of suspense. Welcome to Scoob, your AI-powered podcast platform. With over 100,000 minutes of gripping content and a community of 50,000 true crime fans across the USA. Fascinated by cold cases? Hungry for answers? Or just craving fresh insights? Scoob's quick episodes keep you hooked anytime, anywhere. Download Scoob now, available on the App Store and Play Store. Now, let's get back to that fateful morning and the heartbreaking discovery that shook a nation. Let's begin with the morning of December 26th, 1996. The Ramsey family had just returned from Christmas dinner at a friend's house the night before. But at approximately 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey's frantic 911 call would shatter the quiet of that post-Christmas morning. JonBenét was missing, and on the stairs leading from the main floor to the second story, Patsy had discovered what appeared to be a ransom note. A lengthy, bizarre document demanding $118,000 for her daughter's safe return. Detective Linda Arndt arrived at the scene, and what happened next would become one of the most controversial decisions in criminal investigation history, in what she would later admit was a deviation from standard violent crime investigation procedures. Detective Arndt suggested that John Ramsey and his friend conduct a search through the house. This was extraordinary. Typically, only law enforcement personnel are allowed to examine premises and potentially handle evidence in such cases. Detective Arndt advised John's friend that he and John should inspect the house completely, excluding only JonBenét's bedroom. The goal was to determine if anything belonging to JonBenét was either missing or mysteriously left behind. The clock showed approximately 1 p.m. when John immediately headed to the basement door, accompanied by his friend. Detective Arndt herself did not follow. What happened next still haunts everyone involved. Within just 5 minutes, Detective Arndt heard a scream or shout echoing from the basement. She then witnessed John's friend in a hurried state, grabbing the phone in the den, dialing frantically before abruptly ending the call. The friend then dashed back toward the basement, urgently requesting someone to call for an ambulance. From her position in the hallway, facing the basement door, Detective Arnott watched as John Ramsey emerged from the basement, carrying what every parent fears most: his lifeless daughter. JonBenét's long blonde hair was visible as John carried her in front of him, both arms wrapped around her waist, her head elevated above his as he ascended those final stairs. Standing just 3 feet away, Detective Arnott could observe the heartbreaking details with crystal clarity. JonBenét's arms hung motionless above her head. Her lips showed a distinct bluish tint, a sign that life had left her body hours earlier. The rigidity of her small form indicated rigor mortis had already set in. Most chilling was the thin white string tied to her right wrist and a conspicuous red mark, about the size of a quarter, that marred the front of her neck. The lower neck and right side of her face bore the telltale discolorations of livor mortis, the settling of blood after death. Following procedure, Detective Arndt instructed John to lay JonBenét's body on the rug just inside the main entrance. When she touched the little girl's neck, checking for any trace of life, the skin was cold. There was dried mucus beneath one nostril, and as Detective Arndt leaned closer to JonBenét's face, the unmistakable scent of decay was apparent. When John desperately asked if his daughter was alive, Detective Arndt had to deliver the words no parent should ever hear. JonBenét was dead. John's response was a deep, mournful sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. Detective Arndt directed him to return to the den, where others in the residence had gathered, but the damage to the investigation had already been done in ways that wouldn't become apparent until much later. Now, here's where this case takes a turn from tragic to absolutely mind-boggling. What should have been a textbook crime scene investigation instead became a masterclass in how not to handle evidence. The mishandling of the JonBenét Ramsey crime scene is so extensive and shocking that it's taught in police academies as an example of what never to do. When forensic investigators arrive at any crime scene, the first priority is clearing the area of unnecessary people. And yes, that includes detectives who aren't directly involved in processing evidence. This ensures the crime scene remains uncontaminated, allowing forensic teams to collect information effectively while preserving the integrity of evidence. A crucial component is maintaining what's called a proper chain of custody, involving a meticulously managed entry-exit log that records the times and initials of every single person entering and exiting the scene. In the Ramsey case, this log was woefully inadequate. The records show conflicting and duplicate arrival times, discrepancies in the number of individuals documented, and a general chaos that would make any forensic expert weep. But that's just the beginning. Upon arrival, police should have immediately conducted a thorough search of the home from top to bottom. Every door, window, cabinet, closet, and drawer. This fundamental investigative procedure simply wasn't followed. No officer took responsibility for ensuring a comprehensive search was conducted. The failure to search that basement storage room where JonBenét's body was ultimately found altered the entire trajectory of the investigation. The National Institute of Justice later identified significant errors, noting a critical lack of leadership on the morning of December 26th. There should have been a successful transfer of command, beginning with the first arriving patrol officer, then to the sergeant, and finally to the detectives. These supervisors should have immediately removed all non-essential personnel and maintained that accurate entry-exit log we mentioned. But here's what actually happened. The two detective teams who were on call failed to arrive promptly. They delayed their response by over 2 hours because they first went to Boulder Police Department headquarters instead of directly to the scene. When they finally arrived, they were woefully under-equipped, possessing only a single tape recorder, and therefore unable to record interviews with both John and Patsy Ramsey simultaneously. Given the initial assumption that this was a kidnapping, crime scene protocol demanded that the entire home should have been secured with yellow crime scene tape, not just JonBenét's bedroom. Comprehensive photographs and fingerprinting of the entire residence should have been conducted immediately. Instead, after 10 a.m., only one detective remained at the scene, even as critical questions lingered about a potential kidnapper's call and the need for further interviews with the Ramseys. Perhaps most egregiously, John Ramsey should never have been permitted to search the premises unaccompanied by police. He and his wife inherently had a personal interest in the scene, creating opportunities for inadvertent or intentional alterations to the environment. While there was nothing at the time to implicate them as suspects, there was equally no evidence to exclude them from suspicion. Without an officer present when John discovered JonBenét's body, his natural reaction went completely unobserved and undocumented. But the errors didn't stop there. When Detective Lou Smith was later brought into the investigation by the Boulder District Attorney's Office, he was appalled by the continuing mishandling. The lone detective on scene had moved JonBenét's body from the main floor hallway to the living room after John retrieved her from the basement, further contaminating the crime scene. Standard protocol dictated that the Ramsey family should have been immediately transported to the police station after JonBenét's body was discovered. This would have facilitated videotaped interviews, clothing collection, and crucial physical forensic exams to identify any injuries suggesting a struggle. Immediate testing for drugs and alcohol was also essential. These measures weren't just procedural niceties. They were vital for piecing together an accurate timeline of events and preserving evidence that could lead to justice. The cascade of errors was so extensive that experienced officers who later reviewed the case expressed not just disbelief, but genuine remorse over what they termed egregious and persisting procedural failures. What should have been a pristine crime scene that could yield crucial evidence instead became a contaminated mess that would plague the investigation for decades to come. At the heart of this mystery lies one of the most bizarre pieces of evidence ever discovered at a crime scene: the ransom note. This wasn't your typical kidnapper's demand. It was a lengthy, strange document that would raise more questions than it answered and become central to every theory about what really happened to JonBenét. But before we dive into the note's contents, we need to talk about a discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. When Commander Sergeant Bob Whitson returned to the Boulder Police Department at 10 a.m. for a critical meeting with the FBI, he handed over handwriting samples from John and Patsy Ramsey to the department's forgery detective, who had already been analyzing the ransom note. What happened next reads like something out of a crime thriller. After almost 3 hours of analysis, the forgery detective burst into the conference room, holding a tablet containing Patsy's handwriting. But it wasn't just regular writing samples that had caught his attention. It was what he found on supposedly blank pages in the middle of Patsy's tablet. The detective had discovered words written in an odd block letter style that closely resembled the handwriting of the ransom note. Specifically, the words "Dear Mr. N" had been practiced on these pages. Even more intriguing, 7 pages had been torn from the center of Patsy's tablet, and the ransom note itself had been written on the 8th, 9th, and 10th pages of this same tablet. When investigators examined the tears on these pages, they found something that made their blood run cold. The tears matched perfectly with the tears at the top of the ransom note pages, indicating they had been forcibly removed from the tablet. This discovery crystallized a new level of understanding for Whitson and others present. They were potentially looking at evidence of the Ramseys' involvement in their daughter's disappearance. The timing of this discovery becomes even more mysterious when you consider what was happening simultaneously. Whitson tried to call the Ramsey home to notify the on-site detective about this crucial handwriting discovery, but the phone line was busy. At that precise moment, the only detective at the house was making a 911 call to report that John Ramsey had discovered a body in the basement. Although Detective Arnott later documented that she used a cell phone to report finding JonBenét's body, the reason behind the busy home phone line at exactly the same time was never explained. Now, let's examine the ransom note itself. The language sparked intense speculation among investigators, particularly Detective Steve Ainsworth from Boulder County Sheriff's Department, who was temporarily assigned to the Boulder District Attorney's investigation team. Ainsworth believed he recognized certain phrases from the note, specifically from the 1971 film Dirty Harry. Working with retired Colorado Springs homicide detective Lou Smith, whom the Boulder District Attorney had brought in to provide an outside perspective, they compared the ransom note's contents against Dirty Harry and other ransom-themed films. Their theory was compelling. If someone had authored the ransom note using film quotes, they would have needed to spend considerable time watching such movies to extract and curate those specific phrases. The parallels were striking. The note's phrase, "Now listen to me carefully," has clear echoes in Dirty Harry, where the antagonist uses similar commanding language with Detective Harry Callahan. The film includes menacing warnings like, "If you talk to anyone, I don't care if it's a Peking G's pissing against a lamppost, the girl dies," which mirrors the threatening tone throughout the ransom note. Another overlap appears when the film's killer tells Callahan, "It sounds like you had a good rest. You'll need it," which aligns with the note's deliberately unsettling and ominous tone. The ransom note's repeated warnings about the consequences of non-compliance closely parallel the movie's pattern, where similar threats precede the deaths of innocent characters if demands aren't met. This raises fascinating questions. Did the perpetrator come into the Ramsey home with quotes memorized from films? Or was the note written elsewhere using Patsy's tablet and then transported back to stage the crime scene? The $118,000 ransom demand itself was peculiar. It was roughly equivalent to John Ramsey's recent bonus from his company, suggesting the perpetrator had intimate knowledge of the family's finances. The note was also unusually long for a ransom demand, spanning 3 full pages and containing 376 words. Most kidnappers want to minimize their exposure and would never spend so much time crafting such an elaborate message. The handwriting analysis proved inconclusive. Despite intense scrutiny by multiple experts, no specialist could definitively identify anyone as the note's author. The document bore only one fingerprint, belonging to a police investigator, suggesting that whoever wrote it may have worn gloves to prevent fingerprint and DNA transfer. This ransom note represents one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence in criminal history. Whether it was written by a calculating killer trying to misdirect the investigation, or by someone in the house trying to stage a kidnapping, it remains the key to unlocking the truth about what happened to JonBenét Ramsey. Over the years, the JonBenét Ramsey investigation has seen no shortage of suspects, each bringing their own compelling reasons for suspicion and, ultimately, their own reasons for elimination. Let's walk through the most significant individuals who found themselves under the microscope of this investigation. First, there's Michael Helgoth, who was subjected to DNA testing by the Boulder Police Department. Despite initial suspicions, his DNA simply didn't match the foreign DNA discovered on JonBenét's body, eliminating him from consideration. Perhaps the most sensational suspect was John Mark Karr, a 41-year-old teacher who, in August 2006, 10 years after the murder, confessed to killing JonBenét. Karr claimed he was with JonBenét when she died, and his confession sent shockwaves through the media. He had a troubling criminal record, including bail jumping in California on a 2001 child pornography charge. After his confession, Karr was apprehended in Thailand and brought back to Boulder amid intense media coverage. However, the investigation quickly revealed the hollowness of his claims. His DNA didn't match the evidence found on JonBenét's body, and investigators noted that Karr lacked fundamental knowledge about the actual crime scene. The charges against him were promptly dropped, though Karr continued to appear on talk shows and maintained his interest in the case, continuing to exchange information with others seeking answers. Another intriguing suspect emerged from Detective Lou Smith's investigation. This individual came under scrutiny due to a connection with Access Graphics, John Ramsey's company. The man's wife had been fired from the company, and Detective Smith theorized this could provide motive. What made this suspect particularly interesting was that the initials SBTC appeared on the ransom note, which matched the first initials of this man's family members. Despite this compelling circumstantial evidence, DNA testing in 2011 eliminated him as well. His DNA didn't align with the forensic evidence from JonBenét's body, and authorities decided to withhold his identity from public discussions out of respect for his privacy after his elimination. Chris Wolfe represents one of the most controversial suspects in the case. He was turned in by his ex-girlfriend, who painted a disturbing picture of his behavior around the time of the murder. According to her account, Wolfe vanished on December 25, 1996, only to reappear the following morning. Upon his return, he reportedly washed his clothes immediately, took an unusually long shower, and seemed obsessively interested in following the Ramsey case. His ex-girlfriend also reported that Wolfe had exhibited violent tendencies. And perhaps most compellingly, handwriting analysis suggested his writing was the most similar to the ransom note, compared to all other samples tested. This led John and Patsy Ramsey to identify Wolfe as a potential suspect in a book they authored about the case. Wolfe's response was swift and legal. He filed a defamation lawsuit against the Ramseys. However, the case was dismissed by federal judge Julie Carnes in Georgia. Despite all the circumstantial evidence and suspicions, Wolfe's DNA didn't match the evidence collected at the crime scene. His ex-girlfriend remained convinced of his guilt, even hiring her own handwriting expert and conducting a news conference 10 years after the murder, asserting that his handwriting shared numerous characteristics with the ransom note. Another suspect that emerged was a photographer who had taken professional photographs of JonBenét. He drew attention in a bizarre incident in autumn 1998 when he was arrested for walking nude down a main street in a small town in eastern Colorado. During his arrest, he made the unprompted statement, "I didn't kill JonBenét," a declaration that obviously raised eyebrows among investigators. While his spontaneous denial was certainly suspicious, DNA testing once again provided the definitive answer. His genetic material didn't match the sample found at the crime scene. What's particularly fascinating about this parade of suspects is the pattern that emerges. Multiple individuals with varying degrees of connection to the case, different levels of suspicious behavior, and in some cases, confessions or circumstantial evidence that seemed compelling. Yet in every single case, the DNA evidence, the most objective and scientific evidence available, eliminated them from consideration. This pattern raises profound questions about the nature of the case itself. Are we dealing with a perpetrator who has simply never been identified or tested? Is the DNA evidence itself problematic in some way? Or does the answer lie in a direction that investigators haven't yet fully explored? The consistent DNA exclusions suggest that either the real perpetrator remains unknown to investigators, or there are aspects of this case that are more complex than traditional investigative approaches can unravel. Each eliminated suspect represents another dead end, but also another piece of evidence pointing toward an unknown perpetrator whose DNA remains in the system, waiting for a match that has yet to come. Fascinated by the science behind unsolved crimes like JonBenét Ramsey, Scoob serves up quick, data-driven true crime podcasts that break down forensic breakthroughs, DNA mysteries, and the twists that change everything. Join 50,000-plus true crime fans diving deep into the clues that crack cold cases like the Black Dahlia murder, Lindbergh kidnapping, and many more, wide open. Download Scoob now. Returning to the JonBenét case, beneath the cold facts and forensic findings lies a chilling truth, one that could finally unlock the secrets of that fateful night. As we delve deeper into this case, the physical evidence begins to paint a complex and often contradictory picture of what happened to JonBenét on that December night. Let's examine the key pieces of forensic evidence that have shaped investigators' understanding of this crime. One of the most contentious pieces of evidence involves two distinctive marks found on JonBenét's body during the autopsy. Investigators discovered two abrasions on her lower left back and similar marks on her right cheek, which were precisely the same distance apart. This detail sparked significant controversy when Detective Lou Smith proposed that these markings could have resulted from a stun gun. Detective Smith took the autopsy photographs to Dr. Michael Doberson, a respected coroner and medical examiner for Arapahoe County. Dr. Doberson was uniquely qualified to evaluate this theory. In the summer of 1994, he had conducted experiments using anesthetized pigs to determine the characteristics and dimensions of marks left by stun guns. His expertise had made him a sought-after expert witness in cases involving these devices. Dr. Doberson's analysis was striking. He stated with confidence that the likelihood of a stun gun causing the marks on JonBenét's body was considerable. Meanwhile, Boulder coroner Dr. John Meyer, after extensive review, concluded that while the possibility of a stun gun couldn't be confirmed, it couldn't be dismissed either. The stun gun theory was significant because it strengthened the intruder hypothesis. The use of such a device would presumably be unnecessary for the Ramseys to control their own daughter. Moreover, JonBenét's parents claimed they neither owned nor had ever used a stun gun, and no such device supposedly used by the perpetrator was ever found. A definitive answer might have been possible through exhuming JonBenét's body, but by the time this theory emerged, Dr. Doberson noted it was too late. Skin deterioration would have made accurate analysis impossible. However, a police report revealed that Sue Ketchum from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation acknowledged that the marks could very well have been caused by a stun gun. Now let's turn to one of the most misunderstood pieces of evidence in this case: the contents of JonBenét's stomach. The autopsy initially noted the presence of what appeared to be pineapple, which led to rampant speculation about the timeline of her death and her family's involvement. On the morning after JonBenét's disappearance, investigators photographed a bowl containing pineapple chunks on the kitchen table. Tests revealed fingerprints from both Patsy and JonBenét's brother Burke on this bowl. These findings led many to assume that JonBenét had eaten pineapple from her home shortly before her murder, potentially implicating family members in her death. However, the real story is far more complex. It wasn't until October 15, 1997, nearly 10 months later, that experts from the University of Colorado provided a detailed analysis of JonBenét's stomach contents. This analysis, delivered to police in January 1998, revealed something that completely changed the narrative. According to the laboratory analysis, JonBenét hadn't only consumed pineapple. She had also eaten cherries and grapes. Remnants of cherries were found in both her stomach and the proximal section of her small intestine, indicating recent consumption. Grapes were also identified, including their skin and pulp. This suggested she had consumed something resembling canned fruit cocktail, not the simple pineapple that had dominated media coverage. Despite this revelation, the fixation on pineapple persisted, overshadowing the more complex reality revealed by scientific analysis. This case perfectly illustrates how incomplete information can drive entire narratives in the wrong direction. But perhaps the most significant physical evidence in this case is the DNA, specifically the foreign male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing and body. In 1997, the Boulder Police Department sought analysis from two separate agencies to examine foreign DNA samples found in 3 distinct locations: DNA mixed with blood in JonBenét's panties, and DNA under her fingernails on both hands. Despite being faint, these samples exhibited suggestive matches, indicating they originated from the same unknown male. Crucially, this DNA ruled out all Ramsey family members as contributors. The case took a dramatic turn in 2008, when District Attorney Mary Lacey transferred the investigation from the Boulder Police Department to her office and tasked the Bode Technology Group with performing an examination using advanced touch DNA technique. This group was renowned for their expertise, having assisted in identifying victims of terrorism and natural disasters, as well as solving numerous criminal cases. When Bode tested previously unexamined areas of JonBenét's clothing, specifically the inside waistband of her long johns, they discovered 2 new DNA samples. These samples matched the DNA found in her panties from the 1997 testing. The DNA did not match any individual in the Ramsey family, strongly supporting the theory that an unknown male had interacted with JonBenét's clothing during her murder. This DNA evidence led to a significant development. In July 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacey publicly announced the exoneration of the Ramsey family. The presence of identical male DNA on two separate clothing items worn by JonBenét at the time of the murder strongly suggested external involvement by an unidentified perpetrator. Former Boulder police chief Mark Beckner emphasized the significance of these findings, noting that over 200 DNA comparisons had been made without finding a match. The foreign DNA remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the case, offering hope that someday, when the right person enters the system, this case will finally be solved. Among all the theories that have emerged in the JonBenét Ramsey case, perhaps none has been more controversial or divisive than the one that suggests Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét's own mother, was responsible for her daughter's death. This theory, subscribed to by some investigators from the Boulder Police Department in the late 1990s, presents a chilling scenario that continues to have supporters today. According to this theory, Patsy, in a moment of intense anger, either struck JonBenét with a heavy object or pushed her with such force that she hit her head against a hard surface. This would have resulted in the severe injury documented in the autopsy, a skull fracture with an 8.5-inch crack. Significantly, the skin wasn't broken, and the full extent of the damage was only revealed during the autopsy, meaning the injury wouldn't have been immediately visible. The theory suggests that upon realizing the gravity of her daughter's injuries and the potential fatality of the situation, Patsy experienced a complex mix of horror, despair, and desperate calculation. In what proponents of this theory describe as a sudden and terrifying clarity, she understood that if JonBenét were dead or dying, her life as she knew it would crumble. Her family would disintegrate, her husband might leave, and she could face imprisonment. Determined not to let this happen, according to this scenario, Patsy concocted an elaborate plan to deflect blame. She would fabricate a story involving an external intruder who had broken into their home, targeted JonBenét, and either kidnapped or murdered her. If executed successfully, this plan would absolve her of suspicion and convince everyone, detectives, friends, the entire community, that she played no role in her daughter's death. The theory suggests Patsy spent part of that night crafting the ransom note, incorporating phrases similar to those found in action movies. However, critics of this theory point out significant problems with this aspect. Patsy and John had told police they didn't frequent movie theaters, a fact corroborated by their friends. The films in the Ramsey household were largely children's entertainment, and investigators found no evidence in rental records of the Ramseys borrowing action movies with dialogue matching the ransom note. This raises critical questions. If the Ramseys hadn't watched these films, how would Patsy know these specific quotes? The time required to write such an elaborate note also poses problems. Was it premeditated? If so, this would suggest Patsy had planned to harm JonBenét, which seems to contradict the fit of anger premise of the theory. The evidence of the tablet is central to this theory. Remember, investigators found that words had been practiced in block letters resembling the ransom note's handwriting, and 7 pages had been torn from the center of Patsy's tablet before the 3 pages used for the ransom note. Proponents suggest these could have been practice pages. Intriguingly, the ransom note bore only one fingerprint, from a police investigator. This suggests whoever wrote it may have worn gloves to prevent fingerprint and DNA transfer. Despite intense scrutiny by multiple handwriting experts, no specialist could conclusively identify Patsy as the note's author. Supporters of this theory argue that the psychological trauma and stress following JonBenét's injury might have caused a temporary alteration in Patsy's handwriting, making it unrecognizable to analysts. They point to documented cases where extreme stress can affect motor skills and handwriting patterns. The theory takes an even darker turn in its final act. According to this scenario, After staging the kidnapping scene and writing the note, Patsy discovered that JonBenét was still breathing. Rather than feeling relief, the theory suggests she became enraged. Her carefully constructed plan was falling apart. She believed that for her scheme to work, JonBenét couldn't survive to potentially expose what had happened. This leads to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the theory, that Patsy made a calculated decision to ensure her daughter's death, viewing her potential survival as too great a risk to the fabricated narrative that was supposed to save the family. It's crucial to note that this theory has significant problems beyond the movie dialogue issue. The DNA evidence pointing to an unknown male perpetrator directly contradicts this theory. The sophisticated nature of the crime scene staging seems inconsistent with a panicked mother trying to cover up an accident. The physical evidence, including the possible stun gun marks and the complexity of the garrote used in the strangulation, suggests a level of premeditation and knowledge that doesn't align with a spontaneous cover-up. Moreover, the timeline presents challenges. The ransom note was lengthy and elaborate, 375 words across 3 pages. Writing such a document, staging a crime scene, and dealing with a severely injured or dying child would require considerable time and an almost superhuman level of emotional control. However, some investigators found this theory compelling enough to pursue it for years. They pointed to what they saw as suspicious behavior from the Ramseys, their reluctance to speak with police immediately, and various inconsistencies in their statements. This theory represents one of the most divisive aspects of the JonBenét Ramsey case. It pits those who see a family tragedy, compounded by a mother's desperate cover-up, against those who believe the evidence points to an unknown intruder. The fact that experienced investigators could look at the same evidence and reach such different conclusions speaks to the complexity and ambiguity that has made this case so enduringly mysterious. Regardless of one's opinion on this theory, it highlights the danger of tunnel vision in investigations and the importance of following evidence wherever it leads, rather than forcing evidence to fit preconceived theories. The behavior of John and Patsy Ramsey in the aftermath of their daughter's murder became almost as controversial as the crime itself. Their decisions about when, how, and to whom they would speak created a parallel narrative that fueled suspicion and shaped public opinion for decades. Most striking was the Ramseys' reluctance to provide formal interviews to police. For nearly 4 months after JonBenét's death, they did not sit down with investigators for a comprehensive interview. This period of avoidance was seen as highly unusual. In most cases, involving missing or murdered children, family members are interviewed extensively and repeatedly in the immediate aftermath. Instead of cooperating directly with law enforcement, the family took a different approach. They appointed a publicist to manage communications with the press, creating what many saw as an additional barrier between them and the investigation. They also engaged their own private investigators and handwriting experts, rather than working exclusively with those provided by police. Among their hires was John Douglas, a former FBI Behavioral Science Unit profiler who was well known for his work on serial killer cases. While Douglas was certainly qualified, many found this choice peculiar because it suggested the Ramseys were conducting a parallel investigation that potentially undermined official law enforcement efforts. Why would innocent parents need their own team of investigators unless they were trying to control or direct the narrative? The first substantial public interview the Ramseys gave wasn't to police or even to American media. It was to producers of a British documentary in July 1998. This selective approach to publicity fueled further speculation about what they might be trying to protect or control. The police handling of media relations certainly didn't help matters. Law enforcement often failed to correct erroneous media reports that cast the Ramseys in a more suspicious light, allowing false narratives to flourish. For instance, early reports incorrectly stated there was no sign of forced entry into the Ramsey home. Later revelations showed that several doors and windows had been left unlocked the night JonBenét was killed. Not unusual for a neighborhood perceived as safe, but the initial incorrect reporting had already shaped public perception. The relationship between the Ramseys and police became increasingly fraught. The family accused law enforcement of spreading false stories, including allegations about explicit materials supposedly found in the home and suggestions that John's son from a previous marriage, John Andrew, was a suspect. These miscommunications and perceived instances of mishandling further strained the investigation. A significant development came in June 1998, more than a year after the investigation began, when the Ramseys finally participated in an interview, but not with police. They agreed to speak with prosecutors, but only under the condition that no police officers were present. This was unprecedented for key figures in such a serious case, and raised questions about who was really controlling the pace and parameters of the investigation. Prosecutors typically don't take active roles in investigating cases or interviewing suspects due to potential conflicts of interest if the case goes to trial. The fact that the Ramseys could dictate such terms suggested they held considerable leverage in how the investigation proceeded. The situation became even more complex when former friends of the Ramseys publicly called for a special prosecutor to be assigned to the case. Fleet and Priscilla White, who had once been close to the family but had since become estranged, accused District Attorney Alex Hunter of conducting an ineffective investigation. In a public letter, they claimed Hunter had allowed the Ramseys' defense team privileged access to evidence not afforded to others in similar positions. Despite increasing public pressure from police members and local media to replace Hunter with a special prosecutor, it wasn't until Colorado Governor Roy Romer announced that a grand jury would hear the case that some resolution seemed forthcoming. During this period, several actions by John Ramsey raised eyebrows among investigators. He reportedly contacted his pilot to prepare a private plane soon after JonBenét's body was discovered, suggesting an intent to leave Boulder quickly. While he had also immediately called police, creating a confusing narrative. This preparation for departure struck many as suspicious behavior for a grieving father. Investigators also noted that John possessed a copy of Mindhunter, a book about FBI profiling that contained cases with similarities to elements of JonBenét's murder. While owning such a book wasn't inherently suspicious, in the context of other questions about the family's behavior, it added another layer of intrigue. By October 1999, the grand jury had reviewed approximately 30,000 pieces of evidence, but didn't find sufficient grounds to bring charges against the Ramseys or anyone else. The burden of proof for a grand jury is lower than what's required at trial, making their decision significant. However, a revelation in October 2013 added another twist to this story. It was disclosed that District Attorney Hunter, not the grand jury, had ultimately concluded there was insufficient evidence for charges against the Ramseys. This information only came to light after Boulder's new DA had publicly exonerated the couple in 2008, and it emerged after Patsy Ramsey's death from ovarian cancer in 2006. The Ramseys weren't the only family members to face suspicion. Their son Burke became the subject of theories suggesting he had accidentally caused JonBenét's death, leading his parents to construct an elaborate cover-up. This theory gained widespread attention when CBS aired The Case of JonBenét Ramsey in 2016, which implicated Burke. The broadcast resulted in legal action, with a lawsuit that was eventually settled in 2019. The Ramsey family's approach to the investigation, their use of lawyers, publicists, and private investigators, combined with their reluctance to speak directly with police, created an impression of evasion that persisted even after their legal exoneration. Whether this was the calculated behavior of guilty parties or the protective response of innocent people thrust into an unimaginable situation remains a matter of interpretation. What's clear is that their strategy, while perhaps legally sound, created a public relations disaster that allowed suspicion to flourish in the absence of direct communication with investigators. The case demonstrates how the intersection of legal strategy, media management, and criminal investigation can create narratives that persist long after evidence might suggest different conclusions. Perhaps no aspect of the JonBenét Ramsey case is more disturbing than how quickly and completely the media transformed a family's tragedy into a form of entertainment. The coverage of this case represents a watershed moment in American media, marking the emergence of the 24/7 news cycle and showing how the hunger for content could overwhelm journalistic integrity. The media frenzy began on December 31st, 1996, the day of JonBenét's burial in Atlanta, when major networks CBS and NBC introduced the case to the national audience. From the very beginning, the coverage was problematic. JonBenét was consistently characterized as a young beauty queen or six-year-old beauty queen, a description that became the standard across all major networks through the fall of 1997. This characterization was more than just descriptive. It was transformative and deeply troubling. News broadcasts regularly featured videos of JonBenét at pageants, with some programs actually slowing down her performances to accentuate her movements. Certain tabloid shows went even further, integrating suggestive music into these videos of a six-year-old child. By continuously referring to her as a beauty queen, the media facilitated a shift in public perception. JonBenét transformed from simply a murdered child into a more complex figure, a child beauty contestant whose participation in pageants was implicitly connected to her death. This narrative made selling updates to the story more palatable to audiences, but it came at a terrible cost. It diminished the level of compassion directed toward the victim. Even worse, this type of coverage inadvertently suggested that JonBenét's involvement in pageants may have attracted undue attention, possibly even from her killer. This represents the same troubling mentality that asks sexual assault victims about their clothing choices, subtly implying victim culpability. Initially, media scrutiny focused on the Boulder Police Department's handling of the case, but this criticism was neither as sensationalized nor as enduring as what would follow. The dynamic changed dramatically when BPD officials began leaking information that implicated members of the Ramsey family. This transformed the family into prime targets for an increasingly voracious media storm. As the drama unfolded, a parade of so-called experts appeared on talk shows and in newspaper columns to discuss the case. Many of these experts harbored anti-Ramsey sentiments, despite having no direct involvement in the investigation. Verifying the accuracy of these experts' opinions was minimal, leading to an open platform for baseless assertions and wild speculation. Show hosts layered these discussions with provocative buzzwords designed to maintain audience interest. The basement room where JonBenét's body was found became the secret room in media coverage, a term calculated to suggest sinister hidden activities rather than simply describing a storage area. Such language was deliberately chosen to foster intrigue and ensure continuous viewership. The barrage of accusations and fabrications against the Ramseys proliferated across multiple platforms during what was essentially the birth of the modern 24/7 media cycle. During 1997 and 1998, the advent of around-the-clock broadcasting created an insatiable appetite for content, and show hosts needed material that would sustain audience interest on a daily basis. Unfortunately, many viewers failed to differentiate between entertainment and news, assuming that the sensationalized broadcasts were based on verified information. In a frenzied attempt to compete with nonstop broadcast media, newspapers also participated in circulating every minor development in the case, no matter how speculative or poorly sourced. The media's approach to this case was fundamentally exploitative. Television and radio gossip shows, newspaper columns, and tabloids maintained a persistent and critical narrative that significantly boosted ratings for broadcasters willing to capitalize on a child's murder. Even when substantial factual information was lacking, that didn't matter to producers and hosts who had discovered that anti-Ramsey coverage engaged audiences and drove profits. The coverage created a feedback loop that was devastating to the investigation itself. Media leaks from police sources meant that crucial evidence became public knowledge, potentially contaminating witness testimony and allowing suspects to adjust their stories. The constant media presence also made it nearly impossible for investigators to conduct interviews or gather evidence without intense public scrutiny. Perhaps most troubling was how the coverage normalized the exploitation of child victims. The repeated broadcasting of pageant footage, the sexualized characterizations of a 6-year-old, and the transformation of family tragedy into daily entertainment programming set precedents that continue to influence media coverage of similar cases today. The JonBenét case demonstrated how quickly the media could create and sustain narratives independent of factual evidence. The story became self-sustaining, with each new development, no matter how minor or speculative, generating hours of additional coverage across multiple platforms. This media circus didn't just affect public perception, it fundamentally altered the investigation itself. The intense scrutiny made normal police work nearly impossible, while the constant speculation and theorizing created public pressure that may have influenced investigative decisions. When every move is being watched and analyzed by a national audience, it becomes extremely difficult to conduct the methodical, careful work that complex cases require. The legacy of media coverage in the JonBenét case serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of tragedy, entertainment, and profit. It shows how quickly a grieving family can become fair game for speculation and how a child victim can be transformed into a commodity for media consumption. Most importantly, it demonstrates how irresponsible coverage can potentially obstruct justice by contaminating the very investigation it claims to be following. One of the most disturbing aspects of the JonBenét Ramsey case involves evidence suggesting she may have been the victim of ongoing sexual abuse before her murder. This possibility adds another layer of horror to an already tragic case and raises profound questions about what was happening in JonBenét's life leading up to that December night. During online discussions about the case, former Boulder Police Chief Mark Karr addressed several crucial questions that shed light on this sensitive topic. When asked about signs of a struggle connected to her murder, Karr stated that apart from JonBenét's obvious injuries, no additional signs of physical struggle were found at the scene. However, analysis of the autopsy report suggests a different story. DNA was discovered under JonBenét's fingernails, which could indicate that a struggle occurred during her assault. Furthermore, scratch marks on her neck may represent her attempts to free herself from the garrote used in her strangulation, evidence of a desperate fight for life that contradicts the notion that there were no signs of struggle. When questioned about JonBenét's time of death, Karr estimated it occurred around 1 a.m. on December 26th, though it's important to note that the Boulder County Coroner's autopsy report doesn't specify an exact time of death, making this estimate somewhat speculative. Perhaps most significantly, when a participant in these discussions speculated about JonBenét's clothing being found intact and asked whether this meant the perpetrator had redressed her after assault, Karr confirmed this interpretation. However, he noted that it remained uncertain whether the killer had completely undressed and then redressed her, or whether clothing might have been partially removed and then repositioned after the assault. The timeline and methodical nature of the crime led to questions about how much time the killer spent in the house. Karr described the extensive actions taken by the perpetrator, locating materials to write the detailed ransom note, fashioning a garrote, strangling JonBenét, and then wrapping her in a blanket with a favorite nightgown before concealing her body in the storage room. This elaborate sequence suggests someone who either had significant time in the house or was remarkably composed under pressure. An alternative theory suggests the murderer may have accessed the Ramsey home before Christmas, possibly taking materials needed to pre-write the ransom note. This would imply the killer returned on Christmas night with premeditated plans and all necessary materials. Given the Ramseys reportedly lacked security practices and the multiple notepads and pens in their home, Missing materials might not have been noticed. But the most disturbing question involves whether JonBenét had been subjected to ongoing sexual abuse before her murder. When directly asked about evidence of chronic sexual abuse, Beckner indicated that while prior damage to JonBenét's vagina and hymen pointed to past abuse, experts were unable to determine whether this abuse was consistent and ongoing or represented isolated incidents. This uncertainty is particularly troubling because it leaves open the possibility that JonBenét was living with abuse that no one around her recognized or reported. The autopsy findings suggest previous injuries that were consistent with sexual trauma, but the timeline and frequency of this abuse remain unclear. The implications of prior abuse are significant for understanding both the crime and potential perpetrators. If JonBenét was indeed being abused before her murder, it raises questions about whether her killer was someone with ongoing access to her, a family member, family friend, or someone else in her regular environment. Alternatively, if the abuse was perpetrated by the same person who killed her, it might suggest a pattern of escalating violence that culminated in murder. The physical evidence of prior abuse also raises troubling questions about the adults in JonBenét's life. Were there signs that should have been recognized? Were there behaviors or physical indicators that might have alerted caregivers, teachers, or family friends to ongoing trauma? It's important to note that evidence of prior sexual trauma doesn't necessarily point to any specific perpetrator. The damage documented in the autopsy could have resulted from abuse by someone entirely unconnected to her murder, making the case even more complex. However, given the sexual nature of part of the assault that killed her, investigators have had to consider whether her murder was connected to ongoing abuse. The question of prior abuse represents one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case. It suggests that JonBenét may have been suffering in silence long before that December night, unable to seek help or protection from adults who should have kept her safe. Whether this abuse was connected to her murder or represents a separate tragic dimension of her short life, it serves as a reminder of how vulnerable children can be to the adults who have power over them. This aspect of the case also highlights the importance of recognizing signs of child abuse and the tragic consequences that can result when such abuse goes undetected or unreported. While we may never know the full extent of what JonBenét endured, the evidence suggests that her suffering may have extended far beyond the night she was killed. Want to unravel more cold cases and explore the tangled web of unsolved mysteries? Scoob brings you fast-paced, expertly researched true crime stories that dive deep into the darkest corners of history and justice. Join thousands of listeners who refuse to let these cases go cold, because every story deserves to be told, and every victim deserves the truth. No filler, no distractions, just gripping stories, whenever, wherever. As we reach the end of our deep dive into the JonBenét Ramsey case, we're left with more questions than answers. And perhaps that's the most honest place to end. This case has defied resolution for nearly 3 decades, not because investigators haven't worked diligently, but because it represents a perfect storm of investigative missteps, media interference, and forensic complexity that continues to challenge our understanding of criminal justice. What we know with certainty is limited but significant. Foreign male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing and body has consistently excluded all known suspects and family members. This DNA, discovered in multiple locations and confirmed through advanced testing techniques, represents the most objective evidence in the case. It suggests that someone unknown to investigators was present during JonBenét's assault and murder. We know that the crime scene was catastrophically mishandled, with contamination that began within hours of the discovery and continued for days. We know that a bizarre ransom note was written on materials from inside the Ramsey home, using language that may have been borrowed from popular films. We know that JonBenét showed evidence of both recent sexual assault and possibly prior abuse, adding layers of horror to an already tragic case. We also know that the media coverage transformed this case from a criminal investigation into a form of entertainment, with consequences that continue to influence how similar cases are reported today. The intense scrutiny may have actually hindered the investigation by creating public pressure for quick results and by potentially contaminating the evidence through premature disclosure. What we don't know could fill volumes. We don't know who wrote the ransom note or why it contained such unusual language and demands. We don't know how an intruder could have spent hours in the Ramsey home without leaving more evidence of forced entry. We don't know why the crime scene staging was so elaborate, if this was simply a murder made to look like a kidnapping. We don't know whether JonBenét's prior injuries were related to her murder or represented separate trauma. We don't know if the marks on her body were made by a stun gun or something else entirely. We don't know why her stomach contained multiple types of fruit when the focus has always been on pineapple. Perhaps, most importantly, we don't know whether this case will ever be solved. The foreign DNA offers hope. Someday, the right person might enter the system and provide a match. But as years pass and technology advances, we must also confront the possibility that this case represents the limits of what traditional investigative methods can achieve. The JonBenét Ramsey case has become more than just an unsolved murder. It's become a lens through which we examine police procedures, media ethics, family dynamics under extreme stress, and the American justice system itself. It's taught us about the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations, the importance of preserving crime scenes, and the devastating impact that media coverage can have on both investigations and the families involved. For those who knew and loved JonBenét, the lack of resolution means that justice remains elusive. For investigators, it represents a challenge that has shaped careers and changed procedures. For the public, it's become a cautionary tale about the difference between entertainment and truth, between speculation and evidence. As we continue to await answers, JonBenét's case serves as a reminder of why we must demand better from our institutions: better police work, better media coverage, and better protection for children who cannot protect themselves. Her death changed how many departments handle crime scenes, influenced legislation about child safety, and continues to inform discussions about how we investigate crimes against children. The little girl who should have been celebrating Christmas morning instead became the center of one of America's most enduring mysteries. While we wait for science and investigation to provide answers, we must remember that behind all the theories, suspects, and media coverage was a 6-year-old child whose life was cut tragically short. Whether her killer is ever identified and brought to justice, JonBenét Ramsey's case will continue to influence how we think about criminal investigation, media responsibility, and the protection of children. In that sense, perhaps her legacy can be one of positive change, ensuring that future cases are handled with the care, precision, and respect that her case deserved, but too often didn't receive. Until that DNA match comes, if it ever does, the case of JonBenét Ramsey remains a haunting reminder of the complexity of human nature, the fallibility of our institutions, and the enduring hope that truth, however delayed, will eventually prevail.